Okay, so welcome everybody again. Sorry for the delay. I hope we can catch up. Just a quick introduction, the practical things, and really now I've lost my slides. There we go. So we have another Digital Humanities colloquium presentation, this time by Franziska Pannach from the University of Göttingen. But before we really start, a few practical things. So while you're here, please turn off your video and your audio. Will clearly not affect you, Francie, because otherwise we can't hear you. But let's keep off audio and video so we have a good internet connection and we can hear Francie well. If you have any questions during the presentation, please just type them in the chat. There will be some time for discussion after the presentation. If you miss one of the colloquia and you still want to see them, I make them available on the Cellular website. There's a short bit.ly link there as well, but you can also find it on the Cellular website. So all the previous ones are there. And like always, I quickly want to mention the Escalator project might be interesting to some of you. There's a Slack there if you want to discuss with people on digital humanities afterwards. Escalator also has a mentorship program, and what I forgot to mention there, there's also a stakeholder map that's relatively new, and we'll get a presentation on that in one of the next colloquia as well. But you can put your name in there if you think you're active in the field of digital humanities to show what the network is like, what people are working on, to find collaborators, etc. So please check out the Escalator website. Okay, now I'll keep this really short because I really want to go to that presentation. So today we'll have a presentation by Franziska Pannach on a short introduction to digital folkloristics. Now, Franziska is a PhD researcher at the Göttingen Center for Digital Humanities at the Georg August University in Göttingen. Her research interests include natural language processing for narrative pattern analysis, digital folkloristics, mythological studies, digital humanities, and semantic web applications, and also the development of natural language processing tools for low-resource languages. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I think it's something quite different from what we've had. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now I stop my sharing and I need to restart my sharing again if I can find the interface. I've lost my Zoom interface again. This is not the easiest day today.
No.
Let me see. There we go. I hope you can see Francie's slides now. Francie,
thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak to you today. Yeah, as you know, as Menno just introduced me, my name is Franziska Pannach. I work at the GCDH. I also saw in the attendance list that my dear colleague Svenja also joined us, which makes me really happy to get her a bit more involved into the whole DASA scene, because DASA is a bit like you just join and then you would never leave, which is good. So I'm really happy to be there, to be here, and I'm also really happy to talk to you about this. This kind of research, because it's very close to my heart, always has been. And yes, if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and I hope we have some time to discuss later. And we can also, just share ideas on what to do. So this is very broad. I should call this a very short introduction to digital folkloristics, and I'll touch on some things, but I don't go into too much depth with regard to single points. So I want to start with a little quote from Neil Gaiman. Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. And this is something that I really like. As I mentioned in my abstract also, we have so many different ways for children and also adults to engage with content online. We have YouTube, we have movies, we have all sorts of books and stories that we can tell to our children. And nevertheless, we still to this day nowadays come across fairy tale content even in modern adaptations. Like for instance, if you think of Frozen is very popular with children, and you could argue that Frozen is a loose adaptation of a Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Snow Queen. So it's still, there's still something to fairy tales, that of the way they use motifs, the way fairy tales are told, that somehow resonates with the human nature. And that's my belief. My hypothesis is something about this is so close to human nature that it's still popular today, and it's still going to be popular later on. I am going to talk to you a little bit about the data side of things when we work with fairy tales. Then I'm going to introduce a little bit the motifs, fairy tale motifs, and which kinds of resources we have there. I go into narrative structure and fairy tale plot, and I'm going to talk to you about two theories that I work with in the past. And we very briefly talk about digital humanities teaching when it comes to fairy tales and all the ways you can use fairy tales there, or folk tales. And then I talk a little bit about challenges that I face in my daily work, but also that you face in general when you work with fairy tales. In on the data side of things, as you know, is nothing really new for you. Mostly we have text data of all different forms, but fairy tales can also be communicated via pictures. I show some examples just now. Animated, non-animated film. We have objects that also transport fairy tale content, but we also think about, especially when we talk about fairy tales as a way of communicating indigenous knowledge. We also talk about performance arts. It can be communicated as dance. There's ballet version of Cinderella, for instance, that are very popular. But we also think of song, oral art, oral narration and tradition, and all of these things. And for instance, when we talk about text data, usually that should be the easiest way of engaging with any content, right? If we have the text. But since fairy tales studies is a relatively old field, if you put the digital in parentheses, then fairy tales have always been, for a very long time, been an objective and a research objective. And it's not always quite easy to work with fairy tale texts. I show you some examples here. On the left, we see one of the texts that I work with. It's a text by collected fairy tale collection by Henry Callaway, Nursery Tales, Traditions and Histories of the Zulus, in their own words, which is it's remarkable in the sense that it's a very early document where we have written Zulu on the one side and a parallel translation on the other. Now, those of you who do speak Zulu will know that it's not like standard Zulu as we know it today. The writing is a little bit different. You see that sometimes words that we today would write together are two words, for instance. And you would also know that sometimes the translations in single concepts do not really fit. So the English word doesn't really fit what it says in the Zulu, because, for instance, an animal name or a type of animal is exchanged for an English reader to something that an English reader would know, who's never been to South Africa, for instance. That's something that I came across in this. Nevertheless, it's the tales are very interesting to read, and this is something that I really find worth studying, although you always have to look at it also with the idea that this was a missionary who came to South Africa and like collected and like made these tales fit to an English reader. Then we have very classically the Grimm brothers stories. Grimm brothers collected tales for a very long time. The first Children and House Tales edition is from 1812. You see here that the writing is a little bit looks a little bit funny to someone who isn't used to this old font. It's called Frakturschrift, which usually is terrible for OCR. But you also have handwritten notes and things like that. That also could be potentially interesting for someone who works with it digitally. And you see here also that the scan isn't really good because the book is so old. You see that it has like a few spots and marks that could mess up possible OCR and things like that. And here I also put another picture, sources Europeana for both of these. CM Wieland's folk tales and narrations, and this is from 1796, so also 18th, late 18th century. When we talk about data, I also mentioned earlier that we also talk about pictures and objects. I found a few quite interesting examples that I want to quickly show you. One is this picture narration. I don't know if anyone of you had that as a child. It's called the Camera Magica. It's basically like a little device with a light bulb, and then you slide it in like almost like a dia show, and you can project these fairy tale pictures. This is Little Red Riding Hood. You can project these pictures onto a white wall and use it as a storytelling device when you tell a story, or when kids want to engage with the Little Red Riding Hood content. Then we have this, which is quite interesting because I think I had one of these. It's a children's cup and saucer with the Cinderella motif. And this is interesting to me because I also, during my studies, did some classical archaeology. And there you have vase paintings, and you have saucers and kulixes and different types of paintings on dishes, basically, which were used in everyday use, but still they were also used as a storytelling device and as a device of portraying certain myths and portraying um, certain common stories, where in this case, for instance, you see that if you just look at it and you don't know the Cinderella story, it's just a cup with a little girl picture of a little girl on it, but you have to have a certain kind of knowledge transfer from the person using the object, to identify, okay, this is Cinderella. And in the ancient Greek vase paintings, for instance, you have the same thing. The recipient, the person using the object, had to know the story in order to fully appreciate the picture on it. Then I have a stamp here. It's which is basically the same thing. Someone who doesn't know the story of, for instance, this would be the Rapunzel story. We have a girl with very long hair, and she lets her suitor into her house or her tower, where she's locked up. Um, if you don't know the story, this is just a picture of a lady with a long hair sitting and looking out of a window. But since these folk tales are in their culture specific environment so clear that we don't need an explanation, the picture alone is enough to portray the story, although the story itself, what happens in the story, is not even portrayed in this picture. Then I have another example which might be a bit unfamiliar to you. This is a statue in the city of Bremen in northern Germany, of portraying the town musicians of Bremen, which is a bit of a local fairy tale, but with a connection to the town. And in this fairy tale, it's a formula tale, basically, where certain repetitions happen, which is also interesting way of storytelling, where we have the donkey who gets a bit old and his master doesn't want him anymore, so he tries to kill him. The donkey runs away. Same goes for the dog, who's too old to guard the sheep. and the cat is too old to chase the mice, so she's just laying next to the hearth and keeping warm. So these and in the end they are joined by a rooster. So in this case, these four unlikely friends um, start a little gang, and they defeat some robbers, and they finally make it to the town of Bremen. And because each of these animal has a specific sound that they start like a little band and make music, and that's how they get around. And it's just a lovely little story, and we don't need to communicate the whole story to the people of Bremen, because people in Bremen know this story since they've been small children. So it's enough to just put the statue and leave it there. We don't need to communicate the whole fairy tale, because it's already just a reminder that we have in the statue. So that's also why I find it very interesting to work with objects. Then I wanted to show you another example how we can translate folktale stories. It's a Catalan TV show for children from 2008, where basically it's a children's cooking show but made with puppets. And in every episode, the cook is joined by different fairy tale characters, and they tell like certain parts of the fairy tale in order to make like a recipe. And for instance, here in this scene, Snow White, we know Snow White is like a little bit looks a little bit like in the Disney version, so we also have this um, recognizing effect. Okay, this is Snow White, we just have to look at her, so this must be Prince Charming. So she tells the story, and I think they're making like an apple pie or something, so she tells the story about the apple, and then Prince Charming has to go and fetch the apple for the making of the pie or the making of the dish. So this is just an interesting way of how we can also mash up certain things. And if you sometimes if you look at yourself, or if you listen to yourself, sometimes when you talk, you also um, might sometimes come across fairy tale, folk tale, mythology content in your everyday speech. I just was reminded of this a few days ago, where my husband said in a work meeting that he felt his team was like the shoemaker and the elves. So he said, "How are my little elves doing?" to his colleagues, and he didn't need to communicate the whole story. Everyone knew what was meant. So this is like an interesting way of knowledge transfer. Also, that's let me come to motifs, because I think I'm already running like talking longer than I wanted to. So if we talk about motifs, we mean small and recurring elements and themes in folklore. For instance, a magic pumpkin is something that reappears as a small atomic unit, basically, of uh, content in a folkloric text or material. And we can use annotations of these motifs as a starting point for theme detection, for automatic intercultural comparison, for text reuse studies, so we can find out which parts have been reused where, and many more. So there's actually like a lot of studies for motif and motif indices that can and these indices can serve as a controlled vocabulary, because if you have to annotate and find out a motive, it's important that we all talk about the same thing, because otherwise it's very hard to compare two things if we just work purely with the text. And I'll also explain later why on another example why this is challenging. And there are quite a few automated approaches. I have not listed all of them. I have listed those that I find very interesting. Is Jarlot and Finlayson, and the work of Thierry de Klerk and Piroshka Lendvai, and many more. So there are quite a few people. I have put a list at the end with sources and future reading, basically. But those are names that you should if you want to look into automatic indices and also enriching the content and automatic detection, it's a good way to start with those. If we talk about motifs, I said we have this um, motif indices, which can serve as a controlled vocabulary. One of, or the most popular one that people use is the Thompson motif index, short TMI. I have a link here. I don't want to try to open the link because of the screen sharing, so I'll leave that for now. But the link leads to a site at the University of Alberta, which collected the TMI in an basically like a static HTML page. And there's also been another name that you should know if you want to look at this into this a bit more is Forward Karstorp. I think he worked at the Mertens Institute, and he compiled this Mumford tool, which is an automatically generated and enriched TMI application, which is very interesting and very handy to use. So this TMI page here is relatively static. It's hard to navigate it, and this is just makes it so much easier. So I use this all the time. And you can look for a motif. For instance, here I want to see, give me the label for the motif that has anything to do with the calabash, right? So we have, like in the Zulu tales that I showed you earlier, there are quite a few tales that have something to do with the calabash, either in the form of it swallows something, or it holds something, or it's a kind of a vessel for something. And we want to see, okay, which motifs are there, and you can see there's quite a list, and it's relatively easy to to look through. And you can get like this try more abstractation suggestion here, but you can also get all the labels and the description, and then very small, I don't know if you can read this, underneath you see where it has been used with a little bit of a cryptic reference. When we talk about tail types, so motifs, as I said, recurrent small elemental atomic units. For instance, the magic calabash, it would be one of those atomic units. We can also talk about tail types. So tail types are one per folktale. Each folktale is classified exactly into one type, and this tail type index is the most popular one is the Arne Thompson Utah classification system, RTU, and there you can see exactly which tale belongs to which category, and this makes it easy to, if you have enough annotations and if you have enough classifications for tales, to also give a comparison and say, where do we have tales where the mother leaves the children alone and only the youngest child escapes from some form of peril, for instance. And then you can look it up and you can compare all these different entries to the index. So this is also very, very useful. We want to talk about very shortly, because I'm not an expert there, and I would love to get some input also from your side on that. I want to talk shortly about folktales as a knowledge basis. As you all know, probably if you've read a folktale before or listened to one before, that folktales can be a source of indigenous knowledge, and often they are also historical documents, in the sense that they are either compiled by historians or compiled by researchers with an interest in the historical field, or that they also, at the time when they were compiled, it was already historic or almost legendary knowledge that was transmitted through the folktale. And interestingly, folktale storytelling has also been shown to increase early literacy and listening skills in children. I've added the source to that later. It's a very interesting paper that it's not only popular with children, not only something that we for some reason or the other find interesting to hear about, but it's also beneficial to tell our children or to read to our children. Folktales are also a source of social and cultural identity. I wanted to, that's a little bit of the point that I wanted to make earlier with this Bremen fairy tale. So it's something where we can find meaning in either geographical sense or in a social sense or in a cultural sense. And folktales also, not only folktales, also in large parts mythological works also explain the world around us, not always in a very scientific way, but they serve as, sometimes it's called like a pourquoi story, or I think the Greekists call it atology. So something we can't explain and we make up like a legend around this. And I want to give you a short example. I'm not going to read it all to you because I keep a look at the time. From the Harz Mountains, where I'm from, it's called the Rostrappe. So as you can see in this picture, it's like it's relatively small. Actually, it's a little stamp imprint on sandstone. So the Harz Mountains are mainly sandstone from like a glacier that was there in the Ice Age and ended there. So the sand is very soft, so you can actually scratch into it very easily. And there's this imprint that looks, with a little bit of fantasy, a little bit like a horseshoe. So the legend is that there was a very beautiful princess. I think they called her Brunhilda, and Brunhilda. There was a giant called Bodo, and Bodo fell in love with Brunhilda and threatened the king um, to destroy the entire kingdom if he can't marry her. So she one night stole one of the horses of the giant and fled over the Harz Mountains, over a certain valley where there's like a certain little stream going on, and took like a leap of faith and jumped over the valley, and the imprint of the horse where her horse landed marked this horseshoe basically. And then the giant tried to follow her, and he fell into the valley, and he landed in the stream, and has now, as in the form of a hellhound, he's guarding the crown which the princess lost during her jump. She lost her crown, and now he has to, in the form of a hellhound, guard that crown in that little valley. And the stream was subsequently called Bode. So the stream is called Bode after the giant Bodo who fell down. And this is one of those stories where we have something relatively minor, and we build like a legend around it, how this came to be. So this is also a form of knowledge, or a way of how we explain our world. Now I want to come to plot and narrative structure. I have two structural models that I want to talk to you about, because I find them very interesting. It's a way of modeling folktale or any narrative in general. So structural models are applied independently from the representation of the plot. So the plot can be in any form, can be picture, can be text, can be oral narration, can be dance. So we can use these structural models to describe a plot independent of what's in the text. The idea is that stories often consist of similar discrete elements, which I call narrative units, or are called narrative units, that carry a plot. And structural elements can be events, so things that happen, characters, locations, all sorts of things, and they are in some form logically connected. And these structural models, if applied correctly, allow us to analyze and compare plots with the help of these elements. And one of these theories is Vladimir Prop's morphology of the folktale. He defines 31 invariant functions in 5 categories. Functions are structural plot elements, which are defined in a certain way, and they can have subfunctions, and but the important thing is that they appear in a certain sequential order. and a function sequence of these representations describes a plot. He defines 7 character types, which are defined by the functions they fulfill. I will give you an example just now. And originally, it was designed for Russian magic tales. There's always a lot of criticism for prop, but he never really stated that it would apply to anything. But it's still applicable to many other genres. I have seen it apply to Star Wars, for instance. So there's certain parts that you can actually take out and find in very common modern stories as well. I took this out of Antonia Scheidl's bachelor thesis from 2010 because I just love how she visualized this. So these are the 31 invariant functions. You see that we start here with 0 because this initial situation, which is usually there were once upon a time there was a king, he had a daughter. This initial situation that doesn't really have to do anything with the plot, just sets the scene, is not really a function, and everything in there basically gets transformed into this alpha. So the alpha is the representation of the first part of the function sequence, and he has these 5 classes. For instance, preparation class is basically everything that leads up to the conflict. We can have an absentation. That's usually the mother leaves the house or one of the parents leaves the house and says, please don't open this box while I'm gone. And then we would have the absentation function, that is the beta, and then the interdiction, which is please don't do this. And then usually the interdiction is violated, so the kid goes and opens the box. So we already have 3 elements here that make up this function sequence. So you see, this is independent from what really what the quote in the text is. It's a representation of what happens, and we can use these to annotate folk tales and then subsequently relatively easy compare them, because we're just making a sequence of these literals basically. I have in my master's thesis, which is now already quite a few years ago, I wrote a little ontology, like a semantic web application, where I modeled this semantically, this morphology of the folktale, and there you can see we can give a certain metadata for each of the functions. We see which function is it and which classes and subclasses does it have, and also relationship to the certain characters. For instance, the donor tests the hero. The donor in the Russian magic fairy tale is usually someone who gives us like a form of a magical agent that helps the hero along his task. You could, for instance, interpret Obi-Wan in the Star Trek universe as the donor because he actually gives Luke his lightsaber and provides him with the tool that he needs in order to defeat the villain. So in this case, Obi-Wan would be the donor and the hero would be Luke. And the donor sometimes, before he gives out the tool, tests the hero if he's really worthy. And this would be the function for that. Functions and sub-functions are also connected to each other. For instance, I said there's a test of some form or an interrogation. There can be a proposal. The donor says, okay, I give you this magic sword, but you give me your firstborn child, for instance, or something else. And then another function that would describe how the agent is actually transmitted is obviously these 2 functions belong together. So Prop actually made it this these connections that, for instance, swallowing, if the magical agent is swallowed, then it has to be some form, either an interrogation or you can follow this here, or some form of a test or something else. I give you an example just to illustrate this a little bit in the German fairy tale of the Golden Goose. there's a hero called Simpleton, and he meets an old man who's the donor. And after an initial greeting, the old man asks for food and drink from Simpleton's proviant, which would be function D7, other requests. Simpleton shares his sour beer and Aschekuchen, which is a biscuit or like a small hard cake that has been made from the dough that has fallen into the ashes of the hearth or the fire wherever I cook. So something very simple, like a simple meal. So he shares that with the old man. That means the hero performs the other service. So there's the request of something and the performance of according to what was asked. And the donor then rewards the good deed by pointing out a tree to Simpleton, advising him to cut it down in order to find an item which he does not specify further. He just says, chop it down and you will find something nice there. So the agent is pointed out. The donor doesn't actually do anything. He just shows him where it is. And after logging down the tree, Simpleton finds a golden goose, which is the magical agent. It's golden and it makes people stick to it who are too greedy because they just want the golden feathers in the roots of the tree. So this would be an example of how you could annotate and analyze a tale like that. Let me check the time. Okay, I'll try to be a bit quicker. There's another theory that I'm working with mainly now is the Halim sequences defined by Christian Skoll in 2019. And he basically distinguishes between Stoff, which is the fabric of the story, versus what a story is versus what a plot is. So he says a plot is a sequence with specific protagonists and locations appearing in a text or in a picture. And if that those appearances are in natural order, like in chronological order, that would be the story. So if I tell a story and at the end I tell you what I did first, then it would be a plot. But if I go chronologically in chronological order, that would be the story. And the Stoff he is defines as a set of all variants of a Stoff, which is a bit like self recurring. I know that we digital humanists usually don't like that so much, which can be represented by varying characters, locations, objects, and events. So it's a bit like a fuzzy. He calls it a Stoff cloud. I have this little image of the cloud here. For instance, you think of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney movie from 1937, but you can also subsume the Schneewittchen story, the original one, or also the version by Grimm. Then we have this movie 2012 Snow White and the Huntsman, which is very loose adaptation, and we have also musical Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 69. So all of these are different in a way, but we know that they are talking about the same stuff. And all these all these variants of the stuff make up the stuff, and the borders of the stuff are fuzzy because we always add to it. There's always something that can come to be added to the Snow White stuff because there's more variants coming out, or we find an even older version than the thing that we thought was the first version. Yeah, and myths and fairy tales are specific stuff types. I'll try to be a bit more quick about that. So he defines the smallest action-bearing unit as a hyleme, and each hyleme consists of a subject and a predicate in minimum, and it can have an object. But this is not necessarily subject, predicate, object in the text. It's subject, predicate, object in the plot. So subject object is usually either character, an object, location, or a natural phenomenon, and something like that. And a determination would be something that specifies it further. Predicate is either a state or an event, also with determinations. And he says that each stuff variant is constructed of a sequence of hylemes. I give you an example. Zeus kills Typhoon with lightning. would be Zeus, would be the subject. Kills is the predicate. Predicate determination is with lightning. How does he kill Typhoon? Who is the object? That's like linguistically, if you have the high, so this would be the Halim. If you have this, it's relatively easy to read out the different parts of the Halim, but obviously this is not always in the text. This is something that's formulated in different ways. There are different types of Halims. Very shortly, we can have punctual Halims. Harry Potter writes the Hogwarts Express is something that is true at one point at a time. Then he defines durative initial Halims as in something that is true at the beginning and then later on changes. For instance, Harry Potter lives in Privet Drive is only true in the beginning of the first book, but later it changes. Then we have durative constant, meaning Harry Potter is a wizard is something that is true from the beginning to the end. He doesn't always know it, but it's true for the entire time of the Stoffvariant. And then we have durative resultative Halims. Harry Potter is an orphan, meaning something happened, and as a result, this becomes true. This statement becomes true, and then subsequently is true until the end of the Stoffvariant. I have an example here. I think, given the time, maybe I'll not go into too much detail. We see this is an English translation of a Greek myth, part of a Greek myth, and we see that we have lots of different parts here in one sentence, and the Halim sequence that can be derived from that is relatively long. So when Chryse, daughter of Pallas, was wedded to Dardanos, she brought in her dowry the gifts of Athena, governess of the Aegis, the holy goods of the great gods. And I try to mark that here with the colors. That's what I meant. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the order. So the order we have here would be the natural order, how something has to happen like logically, whereas the way I tell the story doesn't necessarily have to be in the chronological order. So when I say Athena, the governess of the Aegis, later on, obviously she has to receive the Aegis first. This must be the first thing that has happened, otherwise she wouldn't be the governess. Yes. Yeah, so you can see that this ordering is relatively different, and you can derive a lot of Halims from one sentence. Mythological and folkloristic Stoffe can vary depending on their source form, geographic location, and the intention of the author or someone who narrates it, the orator, painter, the sculptor, etc. Halim analysis allows transmedial, intramedial comparison and does not rely on the sources in the same language or form. So I can compare the myth as it's portrayed on a vase with a textual source, for instance. But obviously, I have to annotate this first, and it's relatively tricky to extract those sequences. Halim comparison investigates individual changes. That means, for instance, in one variant, I have 7 geese, and in the other variant, I only have 1 goose. That would be an individual change to one Halim. And Halim sequence comparison investigates differences in the Stoff variant. And we are currently trying to, for instance, apply things like multiple sequence alignment to these kinds of sequences. That's something that I found interesting, where you can also maybe add on to if you think that I forgot something or there's something interesting that could also be used using folktales in the age teaching, because when I do teaching, I use folktales for basically anything that I want to do, because it's so close to my heart. And yeah, you can use folktale texts in introduction to text mining. You can use it for text visualization, introduction to visualization. You can just plop it into a Wordle or into Voyant tools, for instance. You can use folktales as source data for basic NLP. You can use it also as a basis, as a data for advanced NLP or machine learning. You can use folktales in language education, obviously, but also in education studies. You can, I don't know if there's anyone from the digital edition side here, but you can also do something of that sort. And when we talk about enhanced editions, you can do a lot of things because we have so much material. You can investigate linguistic phenomena, language change over certain folktale generations. You can use it as an introduction to comparatistics. You can use folktales also obviously and very successfully in creative writing and writing for the web um, if you want to get your students into writing more in their natural language, to their own Wikipedia, for instance, you can ask them, here, take one of your favorite folktales and write a Wikipedia entry for it. You can use it to introduce collections and how to build collections. You can talk about metadata, and you can also use it for digital storytelling if that's something that you do sometimes with your students. So digital storytelling is also something where you can just use a folktale as a foundation and tell your students to come up with creative ways of putting it in a presentable digital form. And I would love to hear if you have any other ideas on how to engage with that. Now, last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges, which are many, many, and I only introduce the main ones here, but there are many challenges. You have in the text, if you're working with text, you do have certain linguistic phenomena in folklore texts, lots of direct speech, which is also a remnant of it being told orally. So lots of direct speech, dialect and regiolectic expressions, especially in the Grimm folktales. We have this that some texts are not even in German; they are in Frisian, which is actually closer to Dutch than it is to German. Some things that I can't even read or understand because it's in certain dialects that are very hard to understand. You have rhymes, as you all know. Rumpelstiltskin rhymes. You have songs and poems as part of folk tales and fairy tales, and you also have, if you work with historic texts, as always, old and outdated expressions that sometimes are also not quite easy to understand and not easy for any NLP algorithm to determine what it means. Then you have things like the role of the narrator and other remnants of the old tradition. You sometimes come across first person suddenly saying something like, I wouldn't tell you this story if I didn't think it was important. Or you have things like the narrator talks of himself in the third person, like the one who tells you this story is has only heard it from his grandmother, things like that. Then you also have some challenges with regard to the source. I quickly mentioned this earlier when I talked about the data. You have different languages. Sometimes the OCR quality is really bad. Sometimes things aren't really accessible. Sometimes it's on the web, but you don't have a good API, so you can't like really access the data using digital approaches, and have to manually copy and paste everything. Then with regard to annotations, plot annotations in particular can be quite tedious if you have if you want to have a good inter-annotator agreement, they can vary a lot by annotators, and especially high lim sequences, because there's no controlled vocabulary for high limbs. Sometimes you just use two people just use different verbs. They try to tell the same story, but the single individual elements just vary depending on who it is. And then last but not least, with regard to pictures, that annotation of narrative on pictures can be very ambiguous. And I show you this example here. It's from, I think, a relief of Persephone being abducted by Hades. And it's basically a story that Hades falls in love with Persephone, and he takes her to the netherworld. And if you can see this here in this painting, she's carrying a rooster. And this rooster, with my colleagues, has been quite a bit of yeah, a topic for discussion, whether or not she really carries a rooster. Is this something that happens in the plot? Or is this an attribute for the person who looks at this picture to see, okay, this must be Persephone because she's carrying the rooster? So sometimes I don't know if any archaeologists are here, sometimes you have things that are attributes to just identify who is shown in this picture. If it's not quite clear from the vase painting or the relief or whatever itself. And sometimes you have things that actually happen, for instance, carrying the rooster. So this was something that was quite a bit discussed with my colleagues, and I don't think they've come really to a conclusion whether or not she actually carried the rooster to the netherworlds, and as a symbol of fertility that was lost during winter times. So this is one thing, but we can also see something else from here, namely that in pictures the whole plot is told in one go. We don't in the text we have like some form of an order, but in the picture we have everything at once. We have the rooster, we have Hades here, we have those two horses, we have the basket where she was just collecting some wildflowers in like a meadow. So everything at once, and it is up to us as the person who's looking at the picture to determine what happened when. And this can be for if we talk about automatic extraction of information, can be quite tricky to find out, has this come first, or did she only lose her basket after they were already gone, for instance. Yeah, things like that. And I think, depending on how late it is, I think I was quite on time. My sources are here. As I said, there are a few names there that if you want to look at digital approaches to folk tales, you should look at those names: Jarlot, Mark Finlayson, Fogart Kastrop, Thierry de Klerk. Those are all yeah, big names in digital folkloristics, and I sometimes do feel that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to what I want to look at, and yeah, some more further reading here. Yeah, thank you very much, and I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Questions,
so much,
comments?
Franzi. I really enjoyed this presentation. I'm not sure if there are any questions. I think John has left. Tanya says, thank you for an interesting, passionate talk. Which of the challenges do you focus on in your thesis work?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. So I'm in my thesis, I work mainly with high lim sequences, and I can go back to this slide. So the problem with the automatic extraction is that if we have implicit parts that are not quite clear from a text, it's very hard to find out without world knowledge. And given that this theory is relatively new, I also have the problem that I don't have a lot of training data, and because there are not that many texts for big data analysis anyway. I'm actually doing very small data analysis. I think I have about 200 Hylim sequences that have been extracted and discussed, and they are high quality in the sense that they are correct in their mapping, but obviously it's hard to compare things to each other if you have that little data. So that's my main challenge that I'm facing. But what I'm trying to do is find like a semi-automated way of extracting Hylims or parts of Hylims, ordering and come up with some semantic similarity measures in order to find out how closely related two or more Hylim sequences are to each other.
Great, thanks. Another question from Sri. Actually, it's two questions.
Yeah.
He wants to know about the what is practical implementation of slide 12, and if you're using TEI, and about the ontology, the size of the ontology, and did you develop that?
Yeah, so I did the ontology. It's we also annotated some folk tales and put it in the ontology as individuals in the ontology. So it's not TI, it's completely RDF XML. And there is a Sparkle endpoint to this, where we can also query the ontology. But obviously, in order to do that, you have to know the ontology quite well, in order to understand what's happening and how to formulate your queries. So yeah, no TI, just normal RDF XML and turtle and these kind of things. And yeah. Can you show me the practical implementation of slide number 12? Is that's this, I think? Yes. So this is basically from Antonia Scheidel's bachelor thesis. I think she tried to semi-automatically read certain functions from the text. I usually just quote this picture because it's just so lovely, and very visual way of seeing the prop functions. So I'm not quite sure what your question is with the practical implementation. Do you mean the function sequences? Yes. Okay. I can. Let me actually try to show you something. If you give me a second, that I can pull up another PDF. Okay. Okay, I think I got it here. I just have to see if I can quickly push it to the other screen. Does something happen there? Yeah, okay. So this is something that I've looked at in my master's thesis. And here you can say, so this is two Igbo tales, respectively, it's one tale. It's called Obara Edo. I hope I pronounce this correctly. And there are basically two folklorists who've extracted function sequences for this tale. And you can see it's the same tale. I could more or less determine that they were using the same textual representation of this. But you see that, for instance, the one annotator added the initial function here. The other one didn't. Then you have additional functions here, the transmission of the magical agent. But certain things, like certain patterns, remain the same. For instance, those errors mean that there's a departure and a subsequent return. So we have that in the middle. There are certain things that happen between the departure and the return. So yeah, there are certain similarities, but it's not quite easy to make two annotations that are exactly the same. Yes, I'm gonna share this exactly. Does this answer the question, Shri? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I realize we are running also a little bit out of time, but there are still a few more questions.
Yeah.
If people do want to leave, then look, we're not keeping you. But if you want to stay, you're welcome. Let me see. So Candice says, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I use fairy tales to teach archetypes and then ask the students to contextualize the fairy tale within their local context to rewrite it using translanguaging. That sounds really interesting.
Wonderful. That's really interesting.
So, yeah, a lot of potential for education studies. Fully agree. You only touched on that briefly, but I think that's really nice. Benson asked, have you examined many other Zulu or African tales?
I have. There was a presentation a few years ago where I worked with a colleague of mine, Aravind Krishnan, and he, when he joined us in Göttingen, we annotated some tales and compared them interculturally using the pop ontology. And he focused on stories from the Indian subcontinent, from the region of Kerala in the south. And I already did in my master's a few annotations of African folktales. So I think we have about, don't let me lie, about 20 or something annotations of the Proprian morphology for African tales. And in comparison, we actually, one of the things that we found out was that this, you see here that in the denouement section, there's this wedding as a ultimate reward, and this can also be like just like a monetary reward, even though it's named wedding. So it's just something that is given to the hero upon solving the task and yeah, defeating the villain basically. And we found out that in the African tales, the sequences usually end after whatever harm is done in the beginning is resolved. So that the reward is not as in I give you something very valuable, or you get a lot of money, or you marry the princess, but it's more getting back to the status quo, defeating the villain, restoring the village, and things like this. And that's something that I found very interesting. But obviously, you have to yeah, keep in mind that we don't have that many annotations that I can say that is something that is true. It's just something that we found out in the data. I would never go around and say it's like that for African tales. But yeah, I have to say African tales are like my one of the things that I enjoy most, because they're so interesting and so creative, and there's so much of oral tradition still noticeable even in the text.
Okay, wonderful, thanks. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I was really wondering, but now you kind of answered it already, the analysis or the comparison cross-culturally. But you already touched on it now. I really like that idea. So you can get this kind of abstract representation, and then you can start comparing across languages, across cultures. I think that's really cool.
Yes, and this is something also that has been done traditionally by folklorists for many years, for hundreds of years already. But now we're in the position in the Digital Humanities where we can assist that process with digital methods, and this is basically where we come in the Digital Humanities.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. But thank you so much for your presentation, Franzi. I really enjoyed it. And thank you all for bearing with us with the initial technical issues that we had. I'm glad that we could at least still see all the slides, and in the end, everything went well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.